Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to meet a most remarkable woman. Her name is Gloria Hass. She is a radio show host, an author, a teacher, but more importantly, she is a life changer. Please welcome Gloria Hass.
Thank you, Rebecca.
You are very welcome. Gloria, you have had some seriously negative experiences in your life. And ironically enough, these very experiences have created the steel, the strength, the determination, and the courage that has made you who you are. They are the motivation for your strength today, a strength that you teach others how to use and how to change their lives. Today, you reach out and help people overcome the very things that you yourself have endured. I am going to open up this floor to you and let you start at the beginning because you have changed so many lives. Tell us how you got started and what happened.
Actually, how it all started was being born into a family of a father who did not know it was wrong for incest and a mother who was mentally ill, and I didn't know until just shortly before her death that she was borderline personality disorder. And then after she had died, I had been reading books on depression and come to find out my mother suffered from depression. And she was also very narcissistic. And she saw me as competition because I'm a female, and she always favored my brother. So it was, for as long as I can remember, I didn't know if my mom was truly happy until I went and looked back on pictures and I saw where she had actually smiled when she was pregnant with me. But my mother had abandoned both my brother and I when we were younger, went off, and she, left us with our dad, and she finally came back. But then, the abuse started more and more with my father always traumatized us and thought it was funny. And back when we grew up, it was okay to grab a switch off a tree or grab your belt and eat your kids till they're black and blue, literally, and with welts. So that's what I grew up with. I remember playing with my dolls and taking a pen or a scissor and stabbing their faces, because I would always ask my mom, am I pretty? And she would never tell me because she had to be the prettiest. And then when my brother had moved out of the house, I was 15, is when my father and incest had started. He would get drunk at work, come home. My mother locked him out of the bedroom, and he would come into my room. And if he didn't touch me, he would stand at the door and masturbate.
These feelings of not being accepted and not being protected started very young.
Yes, they did. I had abandonment issues for years. And my mother, I didn't know that my mother had left, but I would always have nightmares of my mom, my dad, and my brother all standing around in front of me. And I was set off to a place, but I couldn't get up from where I was moving. And they would walk off and leave me. And I would ask my mom, and she said, oh, you're just having nightmares. It wasn't until I was in my 30s that she told me that she had left my father for 6 months. Then I remembered when she talked, and I remembered her coming back, and I remembered kicking my father's mother and telling her I hated her and that it was all her fault, and I can only piece that to when my mother was leaving and saying goodbye.
So you didn't have any adult standing up for you or protecting you?
No, I didn't. Actually, I did when we moved from Indiana to California, Southern California, and my great uncle would stand up for me and everything. And we got along really well. Him and my great aunt were a great support system. And then we ended up moving away, and I was ripped out of my support system when I was 6 years old. So then I had literally nobody.
So basically your self-esteem had no chance to mature properly.
No, it didn't. And my mother would always tell me that I was ugly, and my dad would tell me I wasn't good for anything, and I would never amount to anything, and that I was stupid, and that I'd only be good to have babies and be married, and that's it.
The feelings of your self-worthlessness started because they felt worthless and they were projecting it onto you. It was their inner problem, their issue, not yours.
Yes, they did. And it was when I was in my 30s, early 30s. It's like when the book Women Who Love Too Much came out. There's a local support group. So that was the first time anything with dysfunction and self-help that really came into being. We're not talking like 28 years ago. And I started that, and then I had been on my path of going to counseling, to what is wrong with me, how can I fix me, why do I keep getting into abusive relationships? So my family didn't want me to move out of their comfort zone to where they could control me. I was like a little puppet. Even my brother jumped in on the bandwagon for that. And I didn't live a lot of my life because I had been so beaten down and brainwashed that if I would step out of it, that I wouldn't have family to love me anymore.
And created a problem in you by making you believe it. People that lack self-esteem can be very cruel. People that lack self-esteem project that onto other people. They make other people feel worthless, while the person that's doing that themselves has an inner crisis.
And my mom had asked me one time after my brother had moved out, is your father coming into your room? And at that point, I had thought back about everything I had told her. I mean, he shot me in the breast with BBs. He would beat me. He would do other things. And I would tell her, and she'd say, it's all your fault. And I even ran away from home 4 times, and my mom found me. So when she came and asked me that, I just looked right at her and I said, no, he's not. Because I thought, well, she's not going to believe me. She didn't believe me all the other times. Why would she believe me now? So she said I should have said something. But it wasn't until my late 50s that she apologized, only because my brother came forward and said all the stuff my dad did to him. And she said, I apologize to both of you. Had my brother not come forward, she never would have apologized.
She must have been in a terrible state of tension and stress living with your father.
And he with her.
Yes.
And he with her. They both vied for the center of attention. And they always talked about getting a divorce, which led to insecurity. And my mom would tell my dad, my dad grew up without a father. So my mom would say to him, why don't you take the kids one at a time and spend time with them over at the park? We didn't live that far from a park. My dad would take us on different weekends, and we'd play volleyball, whatever my brother wanted to do. My dad would play ping pong with him if that's what he chose to do. And then my mother stopped liking it because my dad was enjoying himself, and it just drove her nuts that he would have a good time with his children. To her, she wanted to punish him, and instead he enjoyed it, so she took that away.
To help people regain their life, you've used the very pain of your own history. That is absolutely magnificent. You teach them to realize this is not your fault. This was the issue of your abuser projected onto you. It is not your fault. Tell me, Gloria, when did you first begin to realize that what happened to you was not your fault? Because when you did realize it, it created a whole turn in your life. The same turn that you are now reaching out and giving to others. Tell us, please tell us about that.
It wasn't until I was in my 40s, because I had been fighting in my 30s, I had got multiple sclerosis. I was diagnosed when I was 30 years old, and I've had fibromyalgia since I was 5. So I had medical issues to deal with on top of everything, plus the childhood diseases. I started counseling when I was 21, so I'm like 9-10 years down the road with off and on therapy, that I finally went to a therapist that said, that none of this is your fault. And I had never even thought, and I burst into tears, and I said, what? He said, none of this is your fault. So then from that point on, when my parents would say something, I'll say, it's not my fault, this is your issue. And I would start standing up, and even though they would be verbally abusive, I was able, I was living in my own place, and for a period of time I would have to live with them to get on my feet after, medical issues, and moving in with them so I could save up to be able to move out into an apartment and afford it. And they would just be browbeating me and beating me down and everything else. And I asked them, I said, do I at least have some peace and quiet here? And they said no. So I developed some friendships, and I would stay overnight at a girlfriend's house. And sometimes I would stay over there for a week in her guest room just to get away from my family, just to be able to get strong and on my feet. And that's when I started fighting back, was in my 30s. And then by the time I was in my 40s, I was strong enough, and my dad had already passed away. And I would say, okay, I don't have both of them, tag teaming, abusing me. I could just have my mom, and she backed down at that point because she didn't have someone rallying around in her corner. And my brother at that point had disappeared from the family to go off and do his thing. So it's just my mom and I. So even though there was a love-hate relationship with both of us with one another, it was more tolerable. And she would say, well, you don't tell me it's all my fault. And I sat down, tried to talk with her about it. And I said, Mom, if it wasn't my fault, it was your fault and Dad's fault for doing whatever you did. And she would equate my talking back with being disrespectful. But I looked at her and I said, well, whose fault is it when an 8-year-old goes into the bathroom? Remember those big jars of Johnson baby aspirin that you could get, look like a big, huge gallon?
Yeah.
At 8 years old, I went in and I chewed half of those up to kill myself. And I asked my mom, I said, do you know whatever happened to that bottle? She said, no. I said, I ate half of them. I felt myself getting drowsy. I remember laying on my bed, and I was so upset that I came back from not overdosing on baby aspirin when I was 8. And I told her I took it. And that was my first attempt at suicide. And my second and last attempt, I was 25. So I told her, I was in so much pain. I just wanted to be rid of all of them. And I said, it's not my fault, but I'm taking the responsibility to overcome what happened.
Did your mom ever understand that?
No, she never did. She was all my dad's fault, and she did nothing wrong. With borderline personality disorder, it's always everyone else's fault and not theirs. That's their mental illness. And they stay in their comfort zone of mental illness, even though they're very tortured with what they're suffering from.
I grew up in a culture where women had no rights. If my mom had stood up and tried to protect us in any way, she would have literally been in danger. I grew up in a cult where blind obedience was demanded, and women obeyed their husbands no matter what their husbands did, because it was a really precarious situation. If they didn't, it could literally get dangerous. They grew up believing they couldn't even get into heaven without their husband's permission. So that's an open door for a lot of emotional abuse. Strict and complete obedience to the men was literally a commandment of God. And I see parallels here as you talk about your mom. Even though you didn't grow up in a cult, there was a cultural thing going on then. Parallels here in my mother's depression, in the Stockholm Syndrome, in blind obedience, in having to obey your husband and say nothing and don't make waves or you're not a good wife. The whole concept of backing and supporting your husband because you have to. Because you're not a good woman if you don't. You're not a good wife if you don't. You're not socially acceptable. You're supposed to bear anything and everything and say nothing if you're a good woman. There were so many women then that backed and supported their husbands even though their husband was their persecutor. They didn't know what else to do. So much of our culture taught that. Not just in cults, it was taught that that was a woman's place in lots of cultures in the world, not just ours. It's not a new concept.
That's what it sounded like with my mom. And I asked her one time, why didn't you leave Dad? She said, because I didn't want to live alone. And months before she passed away, she had told my brother about this very wealthy man that she had dated. And she said, looked at me and him and said, I wonder if it would have been different had I married him. She always thought that if she married someone else, they would make her happiness for her instead of her being happy herself.
Unfortunately, this is way too common. We don't talk about it that much. Parallels into my life and to the lives of many women. Women where I grew up were taught that they could not strive for or maintain their own happiness, that to do such a thing was totally selfish. They had to sacrifice their life to their family and their husband, that their desire was to be for their husband only, that they were to build their life around him and his needs, and he came first, the family came first, and most of the time she just didn't come into place for any personal thing until after everyone else was taken care of, if it worked at all. It was just the way we were brought up. Women were taught that their happiness depended on somebody else, that they didn't have a right to pursue their own happiness. It depended more often than not on their husband. So the husband came first, and if they didn't have a husband to make him happy, they were inadequate as a woman. And many, many women believed exactly that. So they weren't about ready to complain when they didn't see any other way to live or survive or take care of their children. This is one of the big problems that we have had about domestic abuse. Just denying it and pretending it doesn't exist, because people don't know how to deal with it, particularly the women that are caught up in it. Do you think that that was really a generational thing more than not?
I think it may have been a generational thing because women were urged to get married right away. That's what you did. You got married, you had kids, and you learned to like each other. But I'm listening to the book Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. And it talks about the generations of women being, they called it the housewife syndrome. It's what society put out there. You have your kids, you keep your house, you do this, whether you like it or not, and you stay quiet about it. So it was society for generations. That's what they did. And when I see judges telling women it's your fault, you've been abused still today, I want to go, hello? I want to ask them, are you an abuser? Do you even have a clue as to what's going on? Do you even like women? I just want to come back at them. It's not fair. And it's like, no, we have a voice. We do amount to something. Accept ourselves. Learn to love ourselves. Learn to approve of who we are. Accept our body the way it is. Stop cutting. Stop abusing ourselves. Stop slamming ourselves into walls. Overeating, undereating, all of that. Stop cutting our hair and making ourselves look ugly just because we don't want people to look at us and hide. We just want people to leave us alone because we're hiding behind our destruction. I did. I did that. I thought a man was supposed to be my rescuer. I looked at men as my rescuer. Even though my father was my abuser, I wanted to be rescued. And now I'm 58 years old as of this airing, and I don't want a man to rescue me. I don't want a man in my life. It's just like I enjoy living alone because I finally accepted myself, my body type. My life is blooming and going the way I like it. And I even had a man say, well, you shouldn't say that. And I'm thinking, why? And then he said, well, you shouldn't say that. You don't like being in a relationship. You shouldn't say this. And I thought, now I know why you're not in a relationship, because you have control issues. That kind of domineering. I'm wondering, is he an abuser? Because he wants you to wrap your world around him. He wants everything to be his way. And I had a man tell me recently that you're being demanding, wanting to live your own life. And I said, no, I'm celebrating me by living my own life. And it's very unfair and macho of you to want a woman to wrap everything around you and have no other interests but you. And I'm thinking, this man's in his 60s, and I'm thinking of how archaic that he has not even evolved into allowing another person to be their own person. And there are women that are that way as well. I'm not saying it's just the one way. I remember being in relationships and wanting everything to be just right because I had been abused. I wanted to be able to control what was going on and the outcome. And now it's like, if I don't like something, it's like, okay, what can I learn from this? Do I keep my mouth shut? Who do I not talk to? Who do I make friends with? And you know what? It's okay that I sit home at night and watch the history of the World Series.
And thank you so much for being a guest on this show. Thank you.
It's been my pleasure, Rebecca. It really is, and I'm glad that you've asked me, because my legacy is whatever I can leave behind for people to heal and to be inspired and motivated. That is what I want to do.
Thank you.
Con ropa de azul y seda, la negra que te mintió. Todos los cueros están doblando, solo tus ojos están llorando. Un fardo de cuello duro fumando, un puro de veneno. Diga que siga, no sufre ni la partida, que el cielo también castiga, la culpa de la traición. Las manos en la tambora mientras tu pelo llora, te llora. Digo que es un tesoro de plata, llora tu corazón. Un broche y una esterlina fueron las ruinas de una pasión. Cuando con tiempo arena forró de pena tu corazón. Plata, siempre la plata que hiere y mata sin compasión. Yo digo que una mulata por oro y plata se enamoró. Ay, late que late, que el cuero del pan se bate, con manos de chocolate, el negro que la perdió. Rueda se rueda, lo mismo que una moneda, con ropa de tul y seda, la negra te le limpió. Todos los pelos se están doblando, solo tus ojos están llorando. Que un fardo de cuello duro fumando, un puro caránico. No sufra ni la maldita, que el cielo también castiga, la culpa de la traición. Manos en la tambora, mientras tu pena llora, que llora. Digo que es un tesoro de plata, lloro tu corazón. Digo que es un tesoro de plata, lloro tu corazón. tu corazón, tu corazón.
下一位演员是谁？